Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you all so much for hanging out with me today as we talk all about the Tiny But Mighty Farm. My name is Jill Ragan. I am the owner of Whispering Willow Farm and the author of the Tiny But Mighty Farm. I am so excited to talk to you all today about creating your own tiny but mighty spaces and the necessary steps to put into place to make sure you max out efficiency in your small backyards. So the great grow along has come at the perfect time for all of us to just dive in and learn new efficient systems before we are jumping into our spring and summer gardens. I do want to encourage you all though, grab a notebook and a pen. I'm a notebook and pen kind of gal because I'm going to be dumping a lot of information at you guys, especially if you are not familiar with that intensive small scale growing. And so I promise you, you are going to want these notes on the back end. So pause this video right now, go grab your iPad, your phone, your notebook pad, whatever works best for you, because we are going to cover a lot of stuff in this workshop today. And I'm excited to dive into the details with you. All right, so before we jump into the nitty gritty, for those of you who don't know me, I wanna catch you all up to speed for a second. As I mentioned earlier, I am Jill. My husband Nathan and I farm full time along with our 3 beautiful daughters. I have been growing food for over a decade. You guys, that sounds so crazy, but I've poured so much of my heart, my soul, my passion into making farming a career, and I have just loved being on this journey. Our family, we're nestled in the hill country of central Arkansas, and we don't have a lot of space. We're farming on 4.3 acres, but less than an acre of that is actually ideal for growing food and flowers. And since we don't have a ton of space, we have really emphasized the last few years on that small scale intensive gardening. By doing this, we've not only been able to provide food for our family year round, we're actually in this beautiful opportunity where we're selling food and flowers to our community members. When we realized that this was possible for us, we immediately knew that this was possible for you guys too. And so we have spent the last few years really just building our online audience and sharing our family and our farm and growing a business with our audiences on YouTube and Instagram and our online store. And so it has been such a joy to be able to walk with thousands of people either starting their gardening journey or expanding into small scale growing. And so we hope that you guys will follow us. We are Whispering Willow Farm across all platforms. So come hop on and see what we are up to on the day-to-day. One of my huge passions though is just to highlight that small scale grower. I was so convicted to inspire and encourage people to not be limited by the space they don't have, but to really learn how to utilize and max out the space that they were given. Having been limited my entire farming career on space, I just really felt that. I felt limited by that for many years, and I just want to encourage you guys, you do not have to have a lot of space to crank out a lot of food, and you do not have to have a lot of space to generate revenue from your farm and your garden. So I'm excited to dive into that more later down in the workshop. But just if you don't hear anything else, I want you to know that if you don't have any land, keep watching. We'll get to that in a second, but just be encouraged that there are a lot of ways around things. And I am convinced if you are determined and you put in some hard work and you're genuine and authentic, you will go places and we will get there. And I'm gonna rally you on and be your cheerleader through the process as well. So with that being said, if you don't have a ton of acreage and land, then you are certainly in the right spot. If you don't come from a background of farming, then this is the right place for you. And if you just want to learn how to be an efficient grower, but you aren't sure those principles to put into place, then you, my friend, have come to the right spot today. So in today's workshop, we're going to cover 3 principles. The first one is knowing your why. The second one is efficient principles for the small scale grower. And last, we are gonna talk about how to turn your tiny but mighty space into a business. Now, before you click off of that last part and think it's not for you, I'm gonna encourage you to stay till the end because I might surprise you with some of the things I tell you. So the first principle is knowing your why. Now, this is one that I am going to speak to and come back and reference often throughout this workshop because it really is so foundational. So for each of you, your answer is going to be different, but today I'm gonna ask you to do a little practice with me, all right? I want you to imagine your ideal gardens, all right? And then I want you to imagine yourself in that garden. And sometimes it might help to close your eyes to actually visualize this. This is what I did. But what do you see? Do you see a hobbyist just gardening here and there? Do you see an aspiring farmer? Or do you see someone who wants to be a pillar of sustainability for their family? Whatever picture pops up in your head right now, I want you to pause and I want you to jot down that description on paper because the things that you wrote down are gonna help define you as a gardener and they are going to be your driving factor and your why behind growing food. Now, don't worry, I wouldn't ask you guys to do anything that I was not willing to do myself or that I have not already done myself. So in the honor of being fully transparent, I'm gonna share mine with you all. When I did this practice, I vividly remember seeing my kids running up and down barefoot through garden rows. I recall just harvesting buckets and buckets of produce, my pantry never being empty. I imagine myself being so desperate for this lifestyle that I would do anything to get there. My why in the beginning was to learn as much as I could. I was very determined on being a good student, but over time though, my why changed. So now my why is to provide food for my family and my community. My why is to encourage and educate and inspire other people to start growing food again. So just as my why has changed, guess what guys? Your why is going to change over time. You just have to embrace that. You have to accept the change. You have to just kind of flow with the seasons, if you will. You don't have to be married to this one idea. Maybe I'm speaking to that beginner gardener who's just now starting out. I can almost promise you that the gardening method or the gardening style that you start out with will not be what you end up with, because through that transition of growing as a gardener, you're learning, right? You are learning new ways to work in harmony with nature as you're growing food for your family or your community. And so that was something I really just had to tell myself, is that my why even might change from season to season. I think that knowing your why is so valuable because when you know your why, then you know all of those systems that you need to put in place to ensure yield, right? To ensure success. No one wants to start gardens without a plan and without knowing why they're doing it. And then when the going gets tough, we just quit going, right? Nobody wants to do that. Gardening can be hard. It can be challenging. And so when you know why and you know what you're doing, what your goal is at the front of the season, you're gonna put all those necessary systems in place. That way your foundation doesn't break throughout the season. You're building a firm foundation that you're gonna build your gardens and your farms on. And I think that that is very, very valuable. So now hopefully you all have an idea of your why behind wanting to garden and grow in a small space efficiently. You know what that motivating factor for you is. Now let's jump into the second principle. And this is all about efficient systems for small space. This is when you need to make sure you have your notebook handy, because this is where we're gonna jot down a lot of information. We're gonna be showing you lots of charts from my book in hopes that having this visual reference is really gonna help set you guys up for success. All right, so there are going to be some of you who don't even really know where to begin. You're not sure how to evaluate what you need for your space. You're not sure what your budget or even a practical budget would be. And so I created this farm cost analysis. It's in my book, The Tiny but Mighty Farm, because when I was starting out, this is kind of where I was, right? I knew I wanted to be a farmer. I knew I wanted this to be my career, but I wasn't quite sure. Like, I needed a roadmap. I needed someone to tell me, hey, this is what you need to get started. This is what it's gonna cost you. This is potentially what you could, gross from this on revenue. I just needed someone to get me started, and I knew if I could visually see that, that, then it was going to at least point me in the right direction to be successful at this. And so we're gonna walk through this farm cost analysis right now in hopes that maybe something in here resonates with you. Alrighty, so here we have this broken up into acreage. We also have it broken up into materials needed per acreage. So we've got, a quarter of an acre, a half of an acre, 1 acre, and then more than 3 acres. So once you can identify which one of these is going to be the space that you're working with, you can then go in and see what, seed starting supplies you might need, the layout that might be a good option for you, structures that you would need, infrastructure, soil working, seeding, transplanting, tools, soil fertility, weed management, harvest, post-harvest, delivery, and markets, which is really valuable, you guys. Then at the bottom, we see here it's startup costs. So again, if you know what it's going to cost you, you can start doing that math to figure out how you can start bringing that money back in for your family and produce, which is really important. And then we have gross sales here. Now, if you are just growing with your family in mind, the gross sales won't be as important to you, but I still find it really helpful knowing how much in a dollar and pound amount that I can yield for my family, because then that lets me know how much I'm saving really on my family's food needs. And so if I can sell, $5,000 on a quarter of an acre, gosh, can I grow my family and save my family $5,000? And for me, that's what we're trying to do. And if your why was growing food efficiently for your family, then this farm cost analysis, you can kind of break down and you can pull from all the things that you can make work. And it gives you a good idea of how to set yourself up in a small space to grow a lot of food. So once you have evaluated your analysis, your farm cost analysis, which one is going to work best with the setup that you have, you've identified if you're going to be growing and starting seeds in a greenhouse, or maybe you have just some racks with artificial lighting, in a spare room in your house. Whatever model that you're doing, once you know all the things involved, you know all the pieces to your puzzle, now you can start creating a system that's going to work for you, a system that's going to set you up for success and really automate things and make them super efficient for you. So there are a few things I want you to consider when you are trying to figure out these efficient systems for your small space. And that is, are you going to be growing from seed? Are you buying transplants? Maybe you are just direct seeding your whole garden. Now, each one of these options comes with pros and cons. And so we're going to kind of just dive into that. So that way, by the time you're done with this workshop, you have a clear idea of what you need to get started for your spring and summer gardens to really start maxing out your small space and growing efficiently. All right, so your first option would be growing from seed. Now, why would you want to grow from seed? One, you have so many varieties. If you guys have ever seen a Baker Creek or a Johnny Seed catalog, you're not at a loss here for heirloom and hybrids that are available to us. So that's really appealing to a lot of people, is that you have varieties that you are not able to find at your local nursery or maybe your local store that is carrying seeds. Secondly, you get a jump start on your season. Some by 6 weeks, some by 8 weeks, some by 12 weeks. It's also going to expand your season. So if we were not growing from seed, where I live, we couldn't garden year round. So it's saving us money. We're picking the varieties that we know are going to work best for our gardening styles and our environment and our climate. And then we are able to extend our season and start our season early and really just implement year-round gardening. So my only opinion for starting from seed because you don't need a greenhouse to start from seeds, you guys. I've literally used a coffee table and extended a grow light from my ceiling in my kids' nursery, all right? So when I tell you that we can bootstrap this, and if you want to grow from seed, by golly, you can grow from seed. Be encouraged by that. If a greenhouse is what's stopping you from growing from seed, just throw that excuse out the window, because you can make it happen. So for me, I do think it's a really good option for a lot of people, even if you are on a super small scale, maybe you're that quarter of an acre, you are learning the skill of growing from seed. You're going to be able to troubleshoot. We're going to talk about that in a second. I just think it's going to build you as a grower, as a gardener, as a farmer, if that's what you're aspiring to be one day. And so I would say that the only con, if there is a con, is that you don't know how to do it. But be encouraged that it is really easy to pick up on it, all right? And I always like to tell people, it's like riding a bike. More than likely, when you hop on that bike, you are not going to be an expert BMX rider by the end of that first session, right? You're gonna fall off a few times, you've got your helmet on, you have your elbow pads, your knee pads, you are bracing for the fall, right? If it is your first time starting from seed, I will tell you, you are going to fail at some point. But that does not mean you are a failure, right? You're gonna fail because you're learning. And when you're learning, you're growing and you're filling your tool belt with all of these different tools that's gonna make you a really incredible gardener. And so I always just say, embrace the failure and learn from that. More than likely, the first time you start seeds, you're not gonna have the healthiest, most beautiful transplants that you ever have seen in your entire life, right? So you might have poor germination, but you might actually come to realize that the seeds you were trying to germinate needed to go through a process called cold stratification, which is pretty simple. Don't get overwhelmed here. It just means that there are particular seeds like certain herbs, lettuces, spinach, onions, they need a cold exposure period to break their dormancy. So it could have not even been anything to do with your ability to grow seeds. It could have been that you just didn't know the needs of that particular variety, all right? Let's say maybe you have dampening off really bad and you realize that you just need to back off on your watering, add some better airflow. Or maybe you have really leggy tomato plants and you think you just can't grow seed. Maybe if you're growing inside under racks, you start those grow lights really, really close to the tray, and as they begin to germinate and grow, you continue to move that light higher and higher and higher, right? You're not a bad gardener. You can, in fact, grow from seed, but you might have to troubleshoot along the way, and you have to keep getting back on that bike, and eventually, you might not have to wear the elbow pads. Maybe one day you can kick the knee pads, and you're actually riding really professionally, and you're growing beautiful, beautiful, abundant gardens. So I would say there is no con to grow from seed. You just really have to dive in and be motivated to learn the craft and the skill. All right, so our next option would be buying transplants. Now, there's a lot of cons, in my opinion, to this one. It is not cheap, especially if you are trying to garden organically. You know, I remember last year going to the nursery for these little bitty organic tomato plants that were one in a little cup. They weren't even sturdy enough, in my opinion, to be outside. I just knew the harsh sun was gonna scorch them and kill them. And they were like $9 for organic starts. Well, say you're wanting to grow 60 plants, 60 tomatoes, that gets really, really expensive. And if your goal is to reduce your budget, does it really make sense for you to buy these really expensive organic tomato starts? Or you could spend $5, $6, $7 on 100 organic tomato seeds, and then there's enough for you for this year and next year, maybe even the next, depending on how many that you plan on growing. So if you are buying transplants, it will take that pressure off of you of having to start seeds. Maybe you just don't have the time to start seeds, or maybe that's just a skill you don't want to know. You can buy them and start them. More than likely, and this is actually really dependent on where you live, you're gonna have less availability. All those really fun heirlooms that people grow just to experience because they can't find them in their grocery store, you're not gonna find that transplant at a local nursery. Or you've got this hybrid that a market gardener uses for production and it is just killer. You're not gonna find that at the local nursery either. And so you are gonna be limited on the variety and what's available for you. Usually there are just 2 or 3 main companies that are supplying all the stores across the states, and they're going to be more expensive. So it is certainly going to be less labor intensive on you because you are not starting these seeds either indoors or out in your greenhouse. And so you're just gonna have to weigh those costs. Another option is you could maybe buy a few transplant, but the next thing we're gonna talk about is direct seeding. And this might be something that you implement, buying some transplants and then direct seeding some things that you can. So direct seeding is the easiest of the options mentioned because it is just the most straightforward. You're literally taking a seed, you're waiting until your estimated last frost is cleared, you are dropping it in the ground, covering it with some soil, and making sure that it is getting adequate light and it's planted for the appropriate sun for its needs. And so that's great, right? You might think, why would I not only direct seed? This took out so many other steps. It did, however, you don't get a jump start to your season at all. And if you're wanting to max out efficiency per bed spacing, let's say I've got a grid of lettuce and I'm direct seeding all these lettuces, and I have got either these lettuces sold to a customer, or maybe I am having an event for my family and we're having a big old dinner and all of our friends or family coming over, and I need X amount of heads of lettuce. And I have direct seeded all of this lettuce, but we had about 20% of our space not germinate. Now, that's really unfortunate, because if I'd planted that knowing I needed to harvest X amount for my party or maybe a customer, and I go to direct seed that again, it's not gonna mature at the same time, and I'm either, not bringing in what I am aiming to bring in for my family or this particular family outing, family event. You're not getting as much efficiency per bed as far as guaranteed. So when you are only putting out the best of the best, you're just ensuring that you are feeding your family. You're ensuring that you are now knocking off not only $50 on your grocery budget, but $100 on your grocery budget. Or if you're like me and my family, when we don't have a successful germination, and if we were just direct seeding things, that means that we're not bringing in revenue, which is what our family's income is based off of. So again, knowing your why and knowing what needs, some of us may not even be able to place that gamble. We might just have to start everything from seed or buy transplants. So if you are growing from seed, which I highly recommend, one way that you can really streamline those systems and be super efficient is by succession planting. You guys, this will change your life if you are a small scale grower and you are in a very small space and you want to grow a lot of food, all right? So here I have my succession planting chart. I am a big spreadsheet nerd and I live by spreadsheets, but I swear they are what keep me organized and keep our farm on some sort of good system. Well, succession sowing, for some of you who may not be familiar, it's just a way to extend your harvest throughout the season by staggering your plantings. You do this by seeding your crops at intervals that range from 7 to 21 days, depending on the varieties and the crops that you're growing. How it works is once you harvest your first round, you are immediately planting out your second round, and you're continuing doing that process again and again. So here I have some examples of what we are succession sowing on our farm and how often we are starting these things. So our basil, we're starting every 2 weeks and succession sowing them out, but things like our lettuce and our spinach and even our sunflowers, we are starting these every 7 days to be transplanted out. So when you're doing this and you're implementing succession sowing, you are never leaving a bed empty, right? You are maxing out your small space continuously. So you can either start those seeds in the greenhouse if you have that available to you, or you can easily start these things indoors using artificial lighting and heating. And so the idea is when you go out into the field and you harvest your lettuce or your spinach, you already have transplants inside where you can immediately plant them in their place, and you're not really missing a window there. But then there are some things that we transplant out before the first crop has ended. So for instance, about cucumbers, this is what we implement here at Whispering Willow Farms. We are planting out our second round of cucumbers 2 weeks before we anticipate that first round will die out. It has produced all that it's going to produce. We can start to see signs that the plant's not thriving anymore. It's not putting on as much fruit. We will go ahead and we'll plant out our second round. And by doing this, we never are without cucumbers from after that last frost is cleared and until that first frost is expected again. Versus, let's say we direct seed that cucumber. The cucumber has matured, it's set on beautiful cucumbers, you're able to ferment them, eat them fresh, whatever, and then the plant dies out, right? It's done, it has reached its limit. And you rip all those cucumbers out and you direct seed them again. You are going to have 60 days to maturity until that cucumber is ripe and putting on fruit again. So what does that mean? That means for 2 months, you guys, you're having to source your cucumbers from somewhere else. You're either buying them from the farmer's market, you're going to the grocery store. So you can already see here, if your why was to reduce your grocery budget, so what? Now during this 2-month lull, you're just gonna have to spend all the money you saved at the grocery store again? Or maybe you just wanna grow food for your family year round. What do you do in those in-between spaces? You eliminate those in-between spaces by having plants ready and either planting directly after or before the first crop is ended. That way you can ensure yield day after day, month after month, season after season. Another thing that I think it's important to emphasize on if you're growing in a small space, I do think this will set you up for success, is creating a crop plan. If you haven't noticed by now, I'm a visual person, whether that's a spreadsheet, jotting it down on paper. Many of these graphs and these charts you've referenced have all come from just a grid notebook that I just wrote down, and we ended up putting all of that down into the book, right? And so it's a good visual, because what you can do is you can map out your layout, you can map out your gardening style, you can map out even your space, and you can jot down on paper maybe what varieties you want to grow where are those successions going to take place. Are you rotating? This is something that we also do, is we will try to rotate where we plant our crops periodically. That way it's not always depleting those same nutrients from the soil. Granted, we are adding organic prebiotics to our soil to replenish that, but we don't want to always only plant tomatoes in this one bed. At some point we want to flip-flop that to give that bed a rest of being depleted of all of those things. But you won't know that, you won't understand that rotation until you jot it all down on paper. And the really beautiful thing about this is do it in a pencil, and if you don't like it, or maybe you went to go order a certain seed and they didn't have that variety, or maybe you just have to forfeit growing that crop at all. Maybe you were late to buy potatoes and you're just not going to be able to grow them this year. You just take that eraser and mark it off and put something else in its place. So if you don't like an idea, if it doesn't make sense, erase it and start over. It's more appealing to be able to erase on paper than have started seeds in my greenhouse that I then have to compost. Or for some of you who may be buying transplants, if you put them out into your garden and realize that that's not where you want it, more than likely that could damage the plant and you've wasted time and money. And so no one wants to do that. We want to put those efficient systems in place to have a plan on the front end. So a few more things, if you're really wanting to max out that space that you're in, is knowing your gardening styles, which we're going to touch on in just a second, but also understanding what varieties you are going to grow. This is going to make a massive impact on yield. So I'm actually really excited to dive into this with you guys. All right, so first up, let's talk about choosing the right varieties. Y'all, this was something that when we transitioned on our farm, we had so much growth and abundance, and we yielded so much success that now anytime I get the opportunity to talk about this topic with somebody, hang on, because I'm excited to walk you through this journey, because it's been such an influential part of our transition and scaling our farm on a small scale that I think it's going to be really valuable for you guys as well. All right, so there are many types of seeds that I'm sure you have heard of as gardeners, but today I'm going to talk about two because they are the ones that are commonly known, and that is an heirloom and a hybrid seed. Now, I will be honest, when I started my journey in gardening over a decade ago, I thought heirlooms were the only seeds you grew, because that's what my papa grew in our garden growing up. That's all I knew as a kid, and I was just super naive. I honestly just did not think there was any other seed, and if there was, and I would hear of something like, oh, this is a non-GMO, or this is a hybrid, or whatever, I thought that has to be bad because that's not what papa grew. And I had to realize that, oh, actually, hybrids aren't a bad thing, and there's a purpose for a hybrid, just like there's a purpose for an heirloom. So we're going to kind of dive into the two of these today. That way you can figure out which one's going to be the best for your small space and for what your goals are for that space. So as we started turning our hobby farm into a profitable farm, that's really when we made the switch from an heirloom to a hybrid. And so since I am going to be referencing these two terms, I'm going to go ahead and pop up on the screen here what they are so that you guys can get a good idea of what I mean when I am mentioning these two things. So a hybrid plant is the result of intentionally cross-pollinating two different varieties of a plant species. By doing this, you are hoping to get the best traits and the qualities of each parent plant into the offspring. Now, on our farm, we're growing in high tunnels, and so this is really, really important. Our greenhouse specific hybrids, which were literally crafted and created with those two parent plants to be disease resistant, to be pest resistant, to withstand high humidity that is going to be the atmosphere into a high tunnel. And so when you're growing in specific growing conditions and you have a plant that's been bred for those specific needs, you are going to see very high results and very high yields because that's what it was created for. So depending on your goal and those gardening styles, if you're gardening with the use of a high tunnel or not, hybrids can be very, very valuable. Even if you are just gardening and growing with your family in mind and you just want to put up so much food, say your goal is just to stock your pantry high, I would sacrifice the flavor of an heirloom to grow the production variety of a hybrid because it's just going to yield more. And so that might be something that you're evaluating. We're going to talk later in the next principle about selling. And if you're selling, this is certainly something that you're going to gravitate to more than likely if you are growing a wholesale and you need those really high yields. So on the opposite side of that, an heirloom, it wasn't created with production in mind, right? It was created with flavor. There's so many different unique varieties of heirlooms. They've been passed down from generation to generation. They tell a story. You feel something. And I love that. And so even though we are a farm that sells our food, I'm still growing my papaw's tomato seeds from when I was a kid working in his garden, you know, and you can't replace that with production. And so that's something I do want to tell you. You can find a balance of the two. And so what I like to do is we have got a raised bed garden that we do not sell out of. And so we have always grown those heirlooms in there for us to just experience the flavor, for us to be able to go outside and harvest something that we do not have available at our grocery store. And if that uniqueness is what you are, you know, chasing after, if you just want to have an experience in the kitchen with new flavors and new varieties, you mean flip open that heirloom seed catalog and go to town, because there's going to be so many amazing varieties. And so neither one of them are bad. Each of them serve a purpose. Again, it all depends on what you are trying to accomplish in your small space. I would tell you, grow both of them. See which one resonates. See which one you like the most. All right, so now that you have got your budget, you've got your crop plan, you know how to succession seed, you know if you're, you know, starting from seed, you're buying transplants, you're direct seeding, we've talked about hybrids, we've talked about heirlooms. Now we have to get an idea of the gardening style that resonates for you. There are lots of pros and cons to all of these, so we're gonna put this up on the screen and we're gonna read through some pros and cons of these various gardening styles. All right, first up, let's start with the pros and cons of an in-ground gardening style. So some of the pros would be the cost associated with starting an in-ground garden are much lower than the cost of raised bed gardening. If you have nutrient-rich soil already established, all the hard work is done. You can just continue to improve the soil quality over time, but the upfront labor and expenses related to soil building are not an issue. This makes in-ground gardening very appealing to a grower who wants to keep their budget low. This growing style provides you with more usable square footage for planting, and it's not permanent. In-ground beds can easily be replaced with another crop or moved, and this gardening style usually appeals to the market gardener who is wanting to maximize space and rotate crops. Now, some of the cons that might come with in-ground gardening is that in-ground beds require initial tillage. If you desire a no-till approach, an in-ground gardening will not be the best option, at least not to start. Reduced drainage can be an issue depending on your region, your soil type, and climate. So in-ground beds are more prone to flooding than a raised bed. And it will take longer to improve soil quality, especially if you have less than ideal soil from the start. Continuously building and improving your soil is going to take time. Soil compaction can occur if the beds are regularly walked on to cultivate or plant, and due to the soil being at ground level, it will take longer to warm after a harsh winter. Therefore, you will typically have to plant later than when planting in a raised bed that warms up faster in the spring. In-ground gardening is a great option, even if you are doing another gardening style as well, if you are growing some of those crops that just take up a lot of space. So some of those would be melons, they're very vining. You've got peas, beans, corn, okra, potatoes, sweet potatoes, onions, garlic. Those are things that do really well in an in-ground setting. They can be pretty hands-off and you're not really utilizing your condensed production space. You can just kind of get a plot of ground ready and throw those things in the ground. Next up, we are going to dive through the pros and cons of a no-till gardening approach. No-till is no longer something that only the market gardeners do. It's becoming an efficient and sustainable way to garden for many small-scale backyard growers, which I find a lot of value in. So some of the pros is by using a no-till gardening approach, you are increasing your soil's biological diversity and fertility. No-till doesn't disturb the beneficial microbes, the insects, the microbials within your soil, and the natural soil structure isn't compromised by tilling. The air and water pores within your soil stay intact, which reduces soil compaction and water runoff. No-till saves you money, labor, and time, and many tiny but mighty farms have higher efficiency and higher crop yields when using no-till methods. No-till gardening combats climate change because it reduces greenhouse gas emissions by reducing soil disturbances and keeps more carbon stored in the soil. So you can see the list of pros for the no-till garden are some pretty impactful ones and something you will definitely want to keep in mind when considering what gardening style is best for you. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of a raised bed garden. I know many people have strong opinions and they are either pro raised beds or they're against it. So let's just dive into some of the analytics here and some of these pros and cons that might be something that you all take into consideration. Some of the pros is if you have poor soil quality or unusable ground, raised beds allow you to bring in fertile, rich soil, and you can even practice a no-till style in those beds. Raised beds protect the soil structure due to lack of disturbances like walking in the beds, which can create that compacted soil. You can cultivate and amend your beds from either side. This leads to reduced plant damage. And with fertile, rich soil, your raised beds will have better drainage, especially in regions where you have clay soil. So if you have sandy soil, the water retention will be better. And raised beds can be an excellent way to grow food if you have limited mobility or you are disabled. Now, here are some cons that I really want you guys to think about depending on what your why was at the beginning of this. So of all the options, the bordered raised bed is undoubtedly the most costly. If you aspire to max out the production of your tiny farm and need to build multiple bordered raised beds, the cost will add up quickly. There will be the cost of materials to make the raised beds and the cost of soil to fill them. Weed management would be the same as practicing no-till gardening, but the no-till method is cheaper and more beneficial if you want to maximize yields in a small space. Raised beds tend to dry out quickly, the rate of which will depend on the material you use to construct the bed, as well as the composition of the soil in them. And since your raised beds will likely dry out faster, you will need to water more frequently. And if you don't have irrigation in place, this can become a very time-consuming task. Raised beds are not easily moved. There isn't a lot of flexibility when it comes to relocating your raised beds. So when you decide on the location and the style of your raised bed garden, you will need to ensure it is where you want it for the long term. And a bordered raised bed doesn't allow as much flexibility in your farm's layout. So I am sure as I was listing out those pros and cons of each of these gardening styles, you already had an idea of which one or maybe even a couple you plan on implementing. All right, you guys, now that we've covered different seeds to start, different gardening styles, lots of pros and cons charts, I want to transition into the third principle because I think this is one that is going to be more appealing than many might think, and that is turning your small space into a business. All right, so are you currently maybe working a 9-to-5 job and you just want to spend more time at home? Maybe you love your job, maybe you own your own business, but you would like for your farms and your gardens to maybe pay a couple bills, or better yet, let's say you want your farm and garden to start paying for your farm and your garden. So I knew very early on that I wanted to make farming my career, and so I took those necessary steps to just ensure that I can bring in profit from my farm. And at first, y'all, it looked like selling kombucha and breads, then it transitioned into selling plant starts, and eventually into selling food and flowers to grocery stores and local restaurants. So each of these skills brought in revenue, but each of these skills required different inputs to yield the necessary outputs. So I was working 3 12-hour shifts at a hospital when I was selling those value add products, but at the time it paid for my gardening adventures, all right? And then I was working that same job when I participated in my first plant sale, which brought in enough profit to cover my gardening expenses for the entire year. And eventually we learned how to grow enough food and flowers to cover our farm and our family's expenses for us to be able to do this full time. So you see here, there's 3 different examples here that each brought in revenue. They each played a key part, but it did determine how I was able to scale, the profit that it brought in, and then my time and attention designated to it. So first I want to talk to you all about selling plant starts. This was one of those things that brought in tangible money for me. But let's say maybe you just want to cover the cost of your seeds and soil and you didn't want to participate in a local plant sale. You could easily shoot some text, maybe post on social media and start some extra plants and get rid of them. You could calculate on the back end how many you would need to sell to be able to cover those input costs. And I think that's a really valuable option because you don't need a greenhouse to do it. You can easily start these seeds inside with whatever setup you're already doing. More than likely you have plenty enough seeds, so it really wouldn't require a lot out of you to start the extra ones, and you would definitely make more in the plants that you would sell than the labor and time it took you to start those. So I think it's a great option if you're wanting to cover some of your startup costs. Not saying it's gonna cover all of them, but if you can at least pay for half, and then depending if you're able to scale this now, usually what we sell in plant starts every year funds a big project that we have, maybe a new thing that we need to build, some infrastructure, etc. on our farm, and it's proved extremely beneficial for us. So another option to bring in revenue from your tiny little space would be the farmer's market. This would be considered a direct-to-consumer market, which means you are taking the product directly to consumer and you are able to get that retail price. Now, this might also be a really valuable option for those of you who are working other jobs. Yes, it is going to require a vendor fee at the beginning of the season, and you are going to have to set up for a few hours on a Saturday morning, but you're able to engage in the local community. This is a really viable option because not only can you sell the food that comes from your garden, you can sell any of those value-added products that came from the food. So maybe you're making jellies, maybe you're, doing ferments. You'll have to obviously make sure that you are abiding with the laws of your city and your state, but many farmers markets allow, with all the right permits, those value-add products, and that could be a good way on a few hours on a Saturday morning to recoup some costs. CSA would be another really good direct-to-consumer way to generate income from your small space. So CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. Now, I'm going to be really transparent and say if you are new to gardening, I do not think a CSA is the best endeavor to dive into because you're putting your name and your farm on the line. You are taking the money from customers and you are ensuring and promising a yield. And if you do not know how to crank out succession planting, maybe you've never grown a scale or you've never grown year-round, you might say that you can provide them with something and you've taken their money and you can't. So they provided money to you and you don't have a product to give back to them, and that can get a little tricky sometimes. So I think that a CSA, if you're a seasoned gardener and you've been doing this for several years and you want to create a small CSA, I think that's a great option. But if you're starting out, maybe get familiar with growing food, growing in succession, and growing at scale before you dive into this option. But let me back up for a minute. I did explain what a CSA meant as far as the acronyms that we saw here, but CSA is also known as crop sharing, and it's a way to connect farmers to customers, all right? So most farmers, what we do is we offer a subscription box, and we're ensuring that our consumer receives X amount of products every single week for a specific price and for a specific time. So most growers will make you pay ahead of time, and you're buying into a 10-week share, a 12-week share, a 28-week share, however long, but you've got to really have your planning done because they're paying you up front, which is how a lot of these farms survive. But then you have to make sure that you've got product, because if not, you're reimbursing money. And so you definitely want to make sure that you have experience in growing, because you just don't want to set yourself up to get kind of a bad rap for your farm if you are wanting to try to grow in your community. And then you have your wholesale option. This would be if you're selling to a grocery store, if you're selling to chefs or various restaurants, maybe you're selling to a food hub. So this one is going to require you to more than likely, not be working a job, because wholesale, you are essentially cutting your price in half because they're buying in volumes. And that's the benefit, right? Is that you can go to a chef or a grocery store and they're taking X amount, which is way more than you're probably going to sell at a farmer's market. It's certainly more than you're probably going to put in your CSA subscription boxes. So you're able to sell volumes, but that comes at a cost because you do have to reduce your price by half, which is pretty standard. If you're selling wholesale, you're reducing the cost by half because this is a third-party system, right? The farmer grows it for, let's say, the chef. Then the chef has to then turn it into something that he can sell to his consumer, which is the person coming into the restaurant. So it's one of those third-party things, and each party has to make money off of it. So I have to sell it to the chef at a reasonable price to where the chef can then sell it, and all parties are profiting from it. And so that is something that requires growing a lot more of, knowing your customer on the front end. That way you're not just growing for nobody, because otherwise you're probably going to be wasting a lot. But depending on how big of a small scale and how efficient your systems are, this can be a really viable option to replace your entire income from. I will say though, maybe you are growing just a ton of hybrid tomatoes and you've started 60 tomato plants in a no-till gardening style, and you realize that that was way too many tomato plants for you. You might try reaching out to a local chef and tell them that, hey, for this season, I can guarantee X amount of tomatoes. And some of them will do that. I have worked with some chefs on very short-term notices in the sense of, hey, I have an excess of this more than I thought I was going to have. Do you need some of this for a period of time? In which they accepted, and I was able to offset some of those costs. So that might be an option that you're able to do from a situation to situation basis. What we do on our farm though, because we do practice a direct to consumer model and a wholesale model, we are saving those wholesale accounts for the things that we are getting the highest price per stem and the highest price per pound. So we're selling wholesale, our top flowers that we know we can get more for, that it makes sense growing in volume. And we're doing the same thing with our produce. We're partnering with a restaurant who's able to go through high volumes to where it makes it worth our time. So that is also just something that you are going to want to kind of evaluate and consider. All right, you guys, you did it. Thanks for joining me today in this Tiny but Mighty Farm workshop. Hopefully just packing you full of so much information and encouragement that you can turn your little tiny space into a food producing machine. And even if you want to sell some food, that you can do it. Don't be limited. If I could give you one piece of advice, well, I probably can't just give you one piece of advice. If I can give you guys a couple pieces of advice, one, it would be to embrace the small scale lifestyle, the small scale atmosphere. Do not be limited by the space you have, but truly embrace that space and learn how to max it out efficiently. And number two is believe in yourself. Know that you are capable of doing this. If you want to grow abundant food for your family, know that you are adequate, that you've got all the tools in your tool belt, all the resources that you need to be successful at that. Not saying that there will not be a few bumps along the way, but if you want to grow food, guess what? You can grow food. And I am cheering you on from Central Arkansas. But thank you all so much for hanging out with me, and I'll talk to you guys soon.